in Touch with Gene Heck, a public affairs presentation of TV 35, keeping you in touch with the issues and personalities of Claremore and Rogers County. And now, here's Gene Heck.
Welcome to In Touch. We have a really great show for you today. Noted author Michael Wallis, who's written Oil Man, Pretty Boy Floyd, and Route 66, is here with us today. Michael, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
First of all, I'd like to ask you, after your great success with Route 66, what made you decide to write the story of Pretty Boy Floyd?
The idea for this book had really been swirling around in my mind for some time. Actually, the seeds for this book were sown more than 40 years ago when I was a kid growing up in Missouri, and I feasted on the tales of the early great bandits that my home state, Missouri, produced, the James Boys, Bell Star, the Youngers, and so forth. And I heard about these folks from my grandparents and other people up in Missouri, and then I heard about the other batch of great social criminals, outlaws that came out of the Depression. I heard about them from my parents, and certainly one of the leading bandits from that period was Charlie Floyd, was Pretty Boy. And as a historian and a biographer and someone who likes to set the record straight, I thought when I was finishing up Route 66, this is a likely candidate. I had come across so much Floyd material when I was researching both Oil Man, the Frank Phillips book, and Route 66. So it was a natural next book for me to do.
Mm-hmm. Let's start back from the very beginning. Tell us about the early years of Pretty Boy. Where was he born?
His true name is Charles Arthur Floyd, and he was born in 1904, February 3rd, 1904, in the mountains of North Georgia. A lot of people automatically assume he was a native Oklahoman, and he wasn't. He came from good Georgia stock, hardworking folks, rooted to that land down there, farmers, great hunters, folks who made a little moonshine to help put groceries on the table. And he and his family came from a big batch of Floyd youngsters, and he was right about in the middle. They came over to Oklahoma at around 1911 and settled in Sequoyah County. First the village of Hanson, later out at another small picturesque village called Aikens. And it's in eastern Oklahoma where he really grew to adulthood and then launched his criminal career out of Oklahoma.
Mm-hmm. So as a kid growing up in Oklahoma, was he in trouble a lot? Was he involved in a lot of pranks? I mean, was there anything in his early years that could ever predict that he'd turn into such a
Well, I don't know about that prediction, but he certainly had his share of scrapes, like most boys, especially country boys and boys growing up during that period. He wouldn't turn down a fight. He swiped his share of watermelons. He had there are actually some really sort of almost sweet stories of mischief in the book. Here, now this is much later on. We're looking at some photos that look very much like Charlie Floyd there, and that's actually his son who looked a lot like him. That's Jack Dempsey Floyd. His given name was Charles Dempsey Floyd, and but because of then the Dempsey comes from, of course, Jack Dempsey, the boxer, who was Pretty Boy's hero. The lady in the photograph is Ruby Hardgraves Floyd, Pretty Boy's wife. Now this picture was taken towards almost at the end of Pretty Boy's life, around 1934. Pretty Boy met Ruby down in that country that we've been talking about, where he grew up in rural Sequoyah County. She was a tenant farmer's daughter, and they married, and they had this boy here who's in a way a spitting image of his dad. Looks like a youthful Pretty Boy. Ruby's gone, she's passed away, and Jack Dempsey Floyd, as he's called, or Dempsey by a lot of his family and relatives, lives very quietly out in California. And this picture was from actually a very colorful time. They were out on almost a vaudeville circuit doing a lecture series called Crime Doesn't Pay. And this was going on even when Charlie was alive. In fact, there are great stories, family stories of Charlie Floyd, of Pretty Boy, dropping off relatives in an auditorium, say in Muskogee or one of the towns in eastern Oklahoma, to hear the lecture, and he'd wish them well and say, "I hope you have a good time tonight," when you hear the crime doesn't pay story.
As a boy, were bandits and outlaws common in the state of Oklahoma?
Oh yeah, Oklahoma's always been a good breeding ground for the lawless. Again, thanks in part to my home state of Missouri. You know, the nations, as it was called, Indian Territory and Oklahoma Territory, was a ripe place to go because there were no laws, only Native American laws, and so they could find refuge down here in Oklahoma, particularly in the Cookson Hills or out in the Great Osage or in some of the oil patch towns. So we always had these great tribes of outlaws coming here, the James boys, certainly Belle Starr, some of the other highwaymen from that period, all the way up through the 1920s and 30s.
Mm-hmm. How old was Pretty Boy when he left home, left his family, and kind of struck out on his own?
He was in his late teens, and he went out on the harvest trail and went out through western Oklahoma, harvesting wheat and corn and so forth, and they went up into Kansas, and it was up in Kansas, up in Wichita, where he fell in with a man named John Callahan, a much, much older man who was a leading stolen property fence in that part of the country, and also one of the biggest bootleggers in Kansas. And he started running illicit whiskey for Callahan out of Joplin, which was a wide open town, to the parched plains of Kansas and down into Oklahoma. And that's where he really went from the watermelon theft period and schoolboy pranks into a more serious crime.
Do you think that the economic times, the depression, the poverty that people in not only Oklahoma but throughout the Midwest were dealing with during that time, do you think that was part of the reason why he left home and struck off into this lifestyle?
Sure. Certainly. He, you know, he recognized right away that he wanted to do something more than pick cotton. A lot of people don't realize it today, but cotton was the king. Cotton dominated the agricultural and economic scene in this part of the world.
Yeah, I was very surprised to read that in the book.
It was a terrific factor. And the cotton prices fell immediately after the so-called Great War, as we called it then, later World War I. And the Depression really hit rural Oklahoma, rural Arkansas, Missouri, Kansas, really all throughout this part of the country in the early 20s, far before the great Wall Street crash of '29 and the subsequent depression then. So that had a profound impact on a lot of these people. The other thing would have been, of course, Prohibition, the dryness. It was a spawning ground for a lot of these boys that left the moonshine circuit to go on the bootleg trail, and from there they could graduate to more serious offenses.
So it's really interesting then to see the social history of those times. The Depression, Prohibition really led to the development of these guys.
Yeah, it's absolutely imperative that you do that, and that's what I think I do, and that's what people are telling me that I've accomplished in this book. That was my mission. The key to this book, Pretty Boy, is the subtitle, The Life and Times of Charles Arthur Floyd, because it's the times that I want to give you here, and I use Pretty Boy as a vehicle to tell a whole broad story, the story of the rise of socialism and a lot of the almost revolutionary movements in rural Oklahoma in the early 1900s. The story of the Ku Klux Klan and its insidious rise to power in this nation. The story of the Dust Bowl, the Depression, Prohibition, of moonshiners and bootleggers, and so forth. It really it spans the whole history of the first 3 decades of this century.
I think that's what leads to the book's appeal, is really learning about the history of what went on.
No, I hope so.
Do you think that during the Depression era, a lot of people labeled Pretty Boy as a Robin Hood type figure? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, you know, one of the most difficult things for me, as you can imagine, it was sorting through all the history, well, certainly the pure history, but the legend and the myth. Everyone over the age of 60, certainly in Oklahoma, but from Buffalo, New York to Pueblo, Colorado, has a good Pretty Boy story. Either they saw him ride through town, or he ate at their table, or slept in their barn, he gave them money, this, that, or the other. Most of them are very are very positive stories too, I might add. But what I found with a lot of good, hard research is that some of those Robin Hood stories are indeed true. There are many instances where he did give money to people. He certainly paid his own way. If he took a meal from someone, he gave them a $1 bill or a $5 bill or a $20 bill. And let's remember, a $5 bill or $20 bill during the Great Depression was an incredible amount of money. He was very much like a guerrilla fighter, like a Viet Cong almost. He would take advantage of good relations with the villagers, with the farmers and so forth, and sort of live off the land and come and go as he pleased. There are instances too, I might tell you about this Robin Hood, where he would actually tear up first mortgages before they were recorded, which greatly endeared him to people.
Yes, that would be nice.
It'd be wonderful.
Where did the majority of his crimes take place? In Oklahoma or surrounding states?
I would say certainly in Oklahoma. He robbed in his total big league career, which was from 1929 when he was released from the penitentiary at Jefferson City, Missouri, until his death in 1934. At the very most 50 banks, which is a lot of banks, but certainly not 500 or 1,000 as some people would lead you to believe. He also didn't kill as many people as we've been led to believe. I can only prove for sure that he killed one man. There's one man that he openly talked about killing. He regretted killing him, but he did kill him, a man named Irv Kelly, a very respected former lawman turned bounty hunter from Eufaula, and he killed Irv Kelly out near Bixby, Oklahoma. Probably his actions, and it's hard to say whose bullets hit who in a gun battle, but led to the death of maybe 4 or 5 others. But again, he wasn't the mad dog killer that the FBI and others would lead us to believe. Mm-hmm. Most of these robberies took place, though, in Oklahoma, Kansas, Missouri, and Ohio.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the FBI. Recently, OETA Television has put together a little piece that we're going to take a look at right now that gives us another look at the Kansas City Massacre.
Good.
Michael Wallis is the man who wrote Route 66, The Mother Road. This week, his latest book is published. It's a biography of Charles Arthur Floyd. You might know him better as Pretty Boy Floyd. In the 1930s, the FBI considered him public enemy #1. In our Places segment, we go to Floyd's hometown of Sallisaw to see what folks there think of old Pretty Boy.
If you'll gather around me, children, a story I will tell about Pretty Boy Floyd, an outlaw. Oklahoma knew him well.
Pretty Boy Floyd spent time as a youngster in the Cookson Hills around Sallisaw. He was an average youngster that would become an exceptional outlaw, robbing banks from New York to Colorado. His family in Sallisaw wanted Charlie to surrender, but he never did.
Even though they didn't like what he did, and they tried to get him to come home, you know, at times and quit it, he just got in so deep he couldn't back out.
Charlie had a career of robbery and murder. He was hunted by the FBI, and the reward for his capture paid a bonus if Charlie was killed. This headstone is the final stop for Pretty Boy Floyd, but it's certainly not the end to his legacy. Here in Sallisaw, he was known for his kind-hearted, not his criminal side. While the FBI called him public enemy #1, around here he was known just as Charlie. Charlie Floyd, the boy down the street in Sallisaw.
Folks, the common folks, the stock from where Floyd came, not only his family but old friends, called him Charlie, or Chalk, C-H-O-C, for Choctaw beer, a home brew that he liked.
But many a starving farmer, the same old story told, how the outlaw paid their mortgage and saved their little home.
There are instances where Charlie Floyd tore up mortgages, first mortgages, before they were recorded at a bank.
When he died, he didn't have any money. He gave it all away. He gave it to the people that needed it. So he was certainly looked upon as a good friend by many, many people in this area and other places too.
In the days when Charlie Floyd was running from the law, the country was trying to forget the Depression. The Dust Bowl days were here, and the people of eastern Oklahoma were desperate for relief.
He only robbed moneyed men. He didn't rob a service station, a hard-working man. He didn't believe in that, and that's what put him aside from other people in that line of business.
Charlie's 5 years of high-profile crime became legend. His business was perfect for the movies. But the high point of Charlie's criminal career was at a Kansas City train station on a day when an old outlaw pal was being sent to prison.
Hey, Frank, come on, boy. Joe, you are the one.
The murders of 5 men were blamed on Pretty Boy, but his biographer believes Pretty Boy was not to blame.
I don't think Charlie Floyd, I do not think Charlie Floyd was a trigger man at Kansas City, nor his running mate Adam Marchetti. But that's the crime that was pinned on him and really caused him to become high profile.
The news shocked the nation and created a public outrage. The police ambushed Floyd in Ohio and executed him on the spot. The year was 1934. Pretty Boy made one last trip to Salisaw. His body lay in state in a house that still stands. Walter Smith remembers the time.
I went down there and I walked around and looked at him, looked over his old head. I said, sure, that's old Pretty Boy. Old Chuck Floyd is sure I'm here. That's old Pretty Boy.
You will never see an outlaw drive a family from their home.
Michael, in the tape, you mentioned that you didn't think Pretty Boy was involved in the Kansas City Massacre. Why?
I really don't think he was there, and I think I proved that conclusively in this book. I go on in here. I actually devote a lot of attention to the so-called Kansas City Massacre. But there are many reasons why Floyd wasn't a participant. The most basic of all is it wasn't his M.O. It wasn't the way he did things. He wasn't a hit man. He had absolutely no connection with Frank Jelly Nash, the fugitive they were trying to liberate at Kansas City. He wasn't part of the gang structure of Kansas City, run ultimately by Tom Pendergast. It was Tom's town, and Pretty Boy was never accepted in that structure and wouldn't have been part of that movement. He and his pal, Adam Marchetti, were in Kansas City that morning, but Adam was probably so hungover he couldn't even see straight at just about the time that crime took place. It was a very well planned event, episode in front of the Union Station, and I think and I hope when the reader finishes exploring what I've presented, they'll feel the same way I feel. Mm-hmm. I think Floyd was a pawn of the FBI, especially at Union Station.
Why was this massacre so significant? In your book, you mentioned that this was the downfall of Pretty Boy. What happened?
Well, it really was, because in trying to liberate Frank Nash, the gunman, and I believe 3 of the gunmen were probably Vern Miller, Harvey Bailey, and Wilbur Underhill. All very well-known names to Oklahomans, by the way, and Kansans and Missourians. Very accomplished and proven bank robbers in their own right. They not only killed Nash, whether accidentally or not, no one knows, but they killed Otto Reed, the chief of police in McAllister. They killed some Kansas City police officers. And more importantly, to Hoover, they killed one of his young federal agents. And J. Edgar seized on that homicide and used it to bring about some very, very critical legislation that totally empowered his bureau, up at that time called the Bureau of Investigation. Shortly afterwards, it became known as the FBI. And from there, he launched a massive, massive public relations campaign. It was Hoover, not Machine Gun Kelly, but Hoover who came up with the term G-Man, which was emblazoned in headlines across the country. And a combination of the crime a year before, the Lindbergh kidnapping and the Kansas City Massacre, are really what put Hoover in the power position he held for decades and decades.
Mm-hmm. Again, the social history of the times
Yes.
really tied in. You've brought with you today some really neat photos that we're going to take a look at that really depict both the life of Pretty Boy and the times that he lived in. Let's take a look.
Oh, let's do, yeah, that's great. These are photos, by the way. I'm very pleased with these. Some of these photos are in the book, or some from these particular batches. This one's not in the book, but it's one that I particularly like. Again, as we showed you earlier, this is Ruby Floyd, Pretty Boy's wife, and his little boy, Dempsey Floyd. Charles Dempsey Floyd or Jack Dempsey Floyd or just Dempsey Floyd, yeah.
Was Pretty Boy a ladies' man? We see his wife there, but it kind of comes out in the book that he was.
He was a ladies' man. He had his share of girlfriends and so forth. This was a very passionate situation, the relationship between this woman, you see here, Ruby, and Charlie Floyd. They were married when they were kids. She stuck with him through the launch of his criminal career in 1925 when he was marched off to the penitentiary at Jefferson City, Missouri. But she couldn't quite wait for him. Right before he was released from prison, she divorced him. And she took up with another man and married him and moved to Coffeyville, Kansas. And we described that episode in the book where Pretty Boy got out of prison and went looking for Ruby and Dempsey and actually got them back. And it's a very sad story, particularly for the gentleman who had married her. And then she stayed with Pretty Boy. They continued their relationship. They never remarried, but they continued their relationship despite all his other indulgences with other women, particularly Beulah Ash, right up until the time that Pretty Boy died. And of course, Ruby was there at his funeral in Aikens, Oklahoma, grieving with the rest, as was his son, Jack Dempsey Floyd, who I'll point out again looks a lot like his daddy.
Mm-hmm. It's really interesting to see those old pictures,
Right.
and it really ties in with exactly what you talked about. Are there any other myths or allegations that you've? I don't want to tell all the stories in the book, but anything else that you can?
Well, there are all sorts of stories that come out of this book that I think are important, again, from the times. But one other myth, if you will, that's been always associated with Floyd is how he died. And he was gunned down on October 22nd, 1934 on a farm, ironically, where he began his life, and he ended his life on a farm, but very near the Ohio River Valley town of East Liverpool, Calcutta, Ohio. And it's always been believed by some, and I present both versions in this book, that Floyd could have been taken alive. I personally believe he could have.
Mm-hmm. I think we got a shot of his wanted, that he was wanted throughout from, I guess, the Wichita newspaper.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe we can kind of get a look at that here.
Sure, that'd be great.
I think, too, that looking at these, it really brings back the social history of the times and
sure.
Really hits home exactly what was going on as far as his notoriety.
Absolutely. Right during that period when they were chasing Floyd through Ohio, a lot of wanted posters were going up all over the place. Here's one for, this is one from Oklahoma for bank robbery and homicide in Oklahoma. And that's a rather beguiling mugshot of Charlie Floyd with his physical description. This is a very early wanted poster because you can see it describes in there George Birdwell, who was one of his lieutenants who Charlie outlived. George Birdwell was gunned down in a bank job at Boley, Oklahoma, 1932. Yeah.
Okay, let's take a look and see what the next picture. These are really classic pictures.
I'm very pleased with the photos. A lot of these are from archives or from people's photo albums. This is a great shot of the town of Earlsboro, Oklahoma. And Earlsboro was a wide open oil patch town, and Charlie's older brother Bradley Floyd and his brood lived down there, and Bradley worked in the oil patch. And Charlie Floyd spent a lot of time in this town, right during the period when this photo was made in the early 1930s and before. And eventually he and George Birdwell even robbed the bank in Earlsboro. So Earlsboro doesn't look quite the same today. It's not as busy. And here's, of course, the classic shot in Oklahoma. This one down, I believe, near McAllister, of some agents breaking up a shine still, moonshiners, and they'd make the barrel up this bootleg whiskey and homebrew Choctaw beer. You know, Pretty Boy, he hated the name Pretty Boy. He liked to be called Charlie or Chalk, and that nickname Chalk comes from Choctaw beer, which was a very popular homebrew during that time.
Where did he get the name Pretty Boy?
He got that name up in Kansas City from a young lady named Beulah Ash, or Beulah Baird. This is a photo right out of a family album. That's Charlie Floyd, looking dapper in his pinstripe suit and his pocket watch, which he loved to carry. And the gentleman next to him, in the bibbed overalls, is a man named Jess Ring, who was Charlie's wife, Ruby. This man was married to her cousin. And he was a very good friend of Charlie Floyd's, a hard-working man down in the oil patch and farming. And he used to like to come to the Ring home down in Muskogee County, right around Boynton and in that area. And that's where Pretty Boy's son was born and so forth. This again is that vintage newspaper shot from the Wichita newspaper. This is from January 1933, and there's a detail from that article of Beulah Baird Ash, or Juanita, as she was also known. Very lovely woman, looks like a 20s or 30s flapper, doesn't she? And she's the young woman who at a boarding house in downtown Kansas City served up the tray of Braunschweiger sandwiches and steins of beer and spied this man, Charlie Floyd, sitting there, a fresh tattoo, pomade in his hair. And she took one look and she said, "My, oh my, what a pretty boy. Where did you come from?" And that name, unfortunately for Charlie, stuck. This is a rather dismal-looking Ruby Floyd, Ruby Hargraves Floyd, and her boy, Charles Dempsey Floyd. This was taken after a little altercation with the Tulsa police, and these two folks were taken into custody. Charlie lived for a short time in Tulsa, out in North Tulsa, in a bungalow which is still very much in use today. And this is kind of the one of the family's favorite portraits of Charlie, taken just a year or two before he was killed. And as you can see there, it's actually a very telling photo. He looks more like a young law student or a physician or the manager of the local store or something.
He looks pretty clean cut, doesn't he?
Yeah, he was not a hardened type. I mean, this is a man who could certainly take care of himself and was not afraid to use his gun or his fists, but he was not, again, certainly not the mad dog killer we'd be led to believe.
So certainly in your book you've kind of challenged some of the allegations against Pretty Boy.
Well, and I've had to, and I didn't set out, what I set out to do, and I brought a reporter's objectivity to this book, but as a historian and someone who's interested in revising history if necessary, what I wanted to see is how many of these stories were true, and certainly we couldn't get them all. I heard literally thousands and thousands of stories. I interviewed personally hundreds of people, but I think the best ones made the book.
We're just about out of time. I hate to cut you off. We could probably go on here for hours, but I really want to personally thank you for joining us today on In Touch and bringing those vintage photos. Certainly everybody's enjoyed looking at them as we have. And good luck with your next book.
Thank you.
We'll hope to see you all on the next In Touch. Have a great week.
RSC TV, KRSC Claremore.